The men who have made history from the decks of aircraft carriers have always been inseparable from the flying machines they love. Bringing their birds home to roost on the roof of their floating home required all the skill they could muster after the tension of combat.
You'd come around and your approach pattern, that's your minimal speeds. You turn into the groove, and you just catch the eye of that signal officer, and you'd love him all the more. You saw his hands out, and he'd just bring you aboard.
After the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, the first naval air battle, there was Midway in June, the engagement that turned the tide against the Japanese forces. Midway, where aircraft carriers and the planes they launched proved again the strategic value of the Navy's ungainly floating airfields. To protect themselves, the carriers covered their sky with fighter combat air patrols. If the enemy should get through, the crossfire of anti-aircraft guns would take over. In that deadly airspace over the Japanese fleet, what was it like to push over a dive bomber at 2 miles up and go whistling down to a gun-filled deck?
You were keyed up, of course, and you were apprehensive of what was taking place. But due to the fact that we'd had many training missions, we were real seasoned. So I think the only thing that you had was the apprehension of whether you're going to make that bomb hit on that deck or not. But you were kind of thinking of that only, nothing else. There was nothing else in your thoughts. You were just doing the job that you're trained to do, and that was it.
Bob Ryder, radio man and gunner, tells how it looked from the rear seat.
The radioman would normally call out the altitude to the pilot as he's coming down, 9,000, 8,000, 7,000. And at 2,000 feet, you'd holler drop. But then we'd level the plane out. At this point, you were beginning to look out for this heavy flak. And you could see this pattern of explosions behind you, and you could hear this old bulldog-type sound going woof, woof, woof. You'd tell the pilot to pull it up, and this woof, woof sound would go underneath it.
For the fighter pilots, even though they worked in teams, it was still, in the end, one man alone in his plane. What does it take to make a good fighter pilot? Gene Valencia, a top Navy ace who won 23 and lost none, sums it up.
He has to be aggressive. He has to love to fight. He has to love to tangle. But he does not, and he cannot do it foolishly. He has to know the performance of his aircraft. It's that simple.
Simple? Another Navy pilot, Hamilton McWhorter, remembers that combat flying is not an occupation that accepts errors of judgment.
You don't get a chance to make but one mistake. Usually that one mistake is the last one.
Landing a plane on a carrier deck, a moving, rolling, pitching platform, also allows few mistakes.
It was like putting a match alongside of a swimming pool. And then you thought to yourself, are we going to make it on that little thing?
David McCampbell, the Navy's top World War II fighter ace.
We've always had a man back on the platform with the landing signal officer, and his job to watch for hooks and wheels down when the plane is well back in the groove, long before time for him to land.
Recently, the blueprints for this fragile machine were dusted off, and a replica of the Navy's first aircraft soared out of history. To a carrier pilot, no two landings are alike. Lieutenant Skip Phelps explains how it is.
It's always something different. The day is different, the sea is different, the wind's different. Now this is 2 years for me Today, it's as new as it was 2 years ago.
As a capital ship of many of the world's navies, has a birthright extending back to the Wright brothers. Not a sleek greyhound of the sea, not a mighty battle wagon. She is a composite, a floating airfield, a battle command center, a city of men, 3,500 hard-working men. The carriers took shape by trial and error, by the changing necessities of their age. Their development was always wedded to the refinements in the design of the aircraft that flew on and off their flat-top decks. This was a marriage of convenience, unsure at first, but a marriage that has grown in importance. Today, their 20th century machinery demands crews that include highly trained technicians, engineers, electronic specialists. The floating airstrips of World War II have doubled in size to become airports, like the USS John F. Kennedy and the nuclear-powered Enterprise and Nimitz, with flight decks covering 4.5 acres. This mobile air base, the Kennedy, can steam to any trouble spot at 600 nautical miles a day. Her airplanes can go to 85% of the world's surface. The Kennedy is free to roam where it chooses. Over the years, American carriers have protected friends and stood off would-be enemies. In peace as in war, they have been the shield and the power of America in a world where no day goes by without threat and crisis. A ship is nothing by itself but steel and machinery. When you put people aboard, it becomes a living thing. And it was with people, visionary and insistent, that the aircraft carrier had its beginning in the first decade of the century. The year is 1909. William Howard Taft is our president. The automobile is still a newcomer in our streets. Hardly have we succeeded in propelling ourselves along the ground on 4 wheels with the gasoline engine, then the Wright brothers have used it to propel themselves through the air. Now, Orville Wright is demonstrating a later model at Fort Myer, Virginia. Navy Lieutenant George Sweet, attending as an observer, reports back, "The Navy must have that. It will be most important to us." With these words, he sets in motion forces that will change history. The Navy's first experiments with the flying machine are directed toward a design that will land and take off from the water. Recently, the blueprints for this fragile machine were dusted off, and a replica of the Navy's first aircraft soared out of history. But soon the question is raised, might an airplane be of greater use to the Navy if it could be flown to and from the deck of a ship? In 1910, at Hampton Roads, Virginia, a civilian pilot, Eugene Ely, tests the idea. He takes off in a 50-horsepower Curtiss plane from a wooden platform built over the bow of a cruiser and lands safely ashore. But could a plane return to a ship and land safely on it? 2 months later, in San Francisco Bay, Ely takes off from shore and lands on a platform rigged over the afterdeck of the cruiser Pennsylvania. Now an airplane has both taken off from and landed aboard a warship at sea. The implication for the Navy is revolutionary. The Navy's first pilot, Lieutenant Theodore Ellison, is already learning to fly with Glenn Curtiss, a pioneer in aircraft design and construction. The first groups of Navy air pilots to win their wings contain men who will make naval aviation history, men who will lead carrier aviation through a world war. Early in the century, there's no question that Britannia rules the waves. But Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm decides to challenge England with a naval race. British sea dogs, old hands at naval warfare, but always ready for new ideas, build His Majesty's ship Furious, the world's first aircraft carrier. The U.S. Navy takes its own steps into the future by fitting 3 cruisers with catapults to launch planes. But as America enters World War I, the battleship continues to play the star role as the capital ship of the fleet. From shore bases on both sides of the Atlantic, Navy planes are the airborne eyes of the fleet, scouting for German submarines. Their brief missions are limited by the short range of the aircraft. Admiral William Sims, the commander of naval forces in Europe during World War I, tells a congressional committee, "The fast carrier is the ship of the future." This same vision of the importance of aircraft at sea has struck a young Japanese naval attaché in Washington, Isoroku Yamamoto. In his words, "The fiercest serpent can be overcome by a swarm of ants." Yamamoto, as a fleet admiral in World War II, will see the truth of this adage work triumphantly for him and disastrously against him. In the same year, Congress authorizes the conversion of the coal ship Jupiter to become a prototype aircraft carrier. In 1919, a flying boat with a far longer range is completed, the NC boat, N for Navy, C for Curtiss. Designed for mid-ocean sub-patrolling, the NC comes too late to help in World War I. It makes another kind of history. Leaving Rockaway, New York, the NC-4 reaches Lisbon, Portugal, stretching the range of aircraft to the width of the Atlantic. But this first crossing of the ocean by a Navy flying boat will become a footnote in aviation history when it is eclipsed by later landmark flights. In 1921, while the Jupiter is still being rebuilt, the Navy undertakes a series of aerial bombing tests using captured German ships as targets. Under the command of Brigadier General Billy Mitchell, Army aircraft sink the battleship Ostfriesland. Our newspapers spread the word. Airplanes have made surface navies obsolete. The Navy quietly reminds us that the Ostfriesland was merely a sitting duck, unable to make evasive movements and unprotected by either its own guns or fighter planes. In 1922, the conversion of the Jupiter is finished. She is commissioned as our first carrier, the USS Langley. At once, she's nicknamed the Covered Wagon. She is fitted with arresting wires across the landing area to catch hooks mounted between the wheels of her airplanes. The planes have no brakes, and shoulder straps are yet to become standard cockpit equipment. In these days, Navy pilots with tongue-in-cheek define a successful landing as one which the pilot can walk away from. But scores of future air admirals will be among the thousands who will win their wings on the Navy's first carrier. It will become a proud boast for graying eagles to say, "I flew off the Langley." That pilot in trouble, Lieutenant Gerald Bogan, will one day, as a Rear Admiral, command a carrier task group through an important battle in World War II.
My tail hook, as it sometimes would happen, instead of engaging the arresting wire, rode one of these fore and aft wires, which caused the plane to slew to the left. There were several people, including Commodore Reeves, standing in the gallery near the 2 smokestacks on the port side, and I was afraid that my propeller would chew them up. So against all regulations, I gave her full throttle, and I did a very beautiful wing over the port side and into the drink. I was picked up by the plane guard.
Retired Rear Admiral Leslie Garys was another Langley eaglet.
The qualification consisted of 3 successful landings and takeoffs. And once you'd made 3 of them, you were a carrier pilot. And of course, we built this thing up. Those of us who were carrier pilots, we affected to look down our nose at all other aviators because we were Langley pilots. And we built this all up to be quite a thing. And then later when we got the other carriers, and it was our job to